To make sure you're in the right class. We are talking today about someone I imagine you've heard of. I know this is hard to see over there, so benefit here to being on my right. Always good to be on the right. So we're talking about Martin Luther today. The sheet that welcome, glad to have you here. Welcome back. Some of you have been in this class as I've gone through the different segments of church history for the last 2 years. Others are here for the first time, and I know how the Sunday school semester goes on. This is our peak. Let's see if we can just grow week by week. But usually this is the peak, and then it gets hard to be here every week. But we're really glad. I'm really glad that you're here. I love doing this. When it comes around each year, I always reflect to Tricia that this is one of my favorite things to do, and I'm glad it's only 10 or 12 weeks because I put a lot of time into this, and I really enjoy it, but it probably only is sustainable for a short burst of time. So I always say I hope you enjoy hearing about these people in church history even half as much as I enjoy studying them and teaching about them. You can see this outline. It's not much of one. Once in a while I may have some handouts over the class, but I'm pretty low tech, low handout. This just shows you where we've been. You can see part 1 was the early church. That was in the fall of 2022. Last fall, part 2, medieval church, the Middle Ages. 451 is the date of the Council of Chalcedon. 1415 is the death of the Bohemian reformer Jan Hus, which was the seeds of protest leading into part 3, beginning today with Martin Luther. So this will cover the Reformation through the Great Awakening. So these may be some of the people, compared to where we've been, who are more familiar. At least their names will ring a bell to many of you, and probably Luther and Calvin are some of the most well-known figures from church history, at least if you're a good Protestant and here at a Presbyterian church, John Knox and others, but you can see where we're going over these 10 weeks. Notice there's a bonus. This is 12 weeks. We have a week at the end that Eric Russ is doing a combined Sunday school class, and we have the Faithful Conference. Stephen Nichols will be here, who works with Ligonier and Reformation Bible College, and he's going to be coming here to do some of his biography on R.C. Sproul and then talk about some other things related to Sproul. But 2 weeks where I'll be gone, you can see Greg Salazar. You may not know that name, but Greg is new to the Charlotte area. He's been a professor of church history at Puritan Reformed Theological Seminary in Grand Rapids, and he's from North Carolina. He and his wife are moving here to do a church plant up at Myers Park. So I think they're still in the Savannah area, but they're moving up here and have been approved by our presbytery, now in our presbytery. So an opportunity for you to get to know Greg, and he's a fine church historian. So he's going to teach on, he's changed. It's not William Perkins. He's going to do John Owen. Whoever it'll be someone in that Puritan vein, and it will be good. And then Don Fortson, who's at our church and is a recently retired professor from RTS of church history. He's going to fill in on the last week and do Gilbert Tennant, a colonial Presbyterian. And then these other 10 weeks, you can see what I will be doing. I will try to bring some material each week, just in case you are really eager and you want to learn more. As you can imagine, there's lots and lots written about the Reformation and about Martin Luther. I recall reading one time, I don't know how you would prove this, but the 3 people who have the most biographies written about them, maybe this is in the English language, I'm not sure, but the 3 people, anyone want to guess? Luther, that was smart, yep. Jesus, biographies are written about him, and then Abraham Lincoln. So Luther, there's lots and lots written about Luther. Here's just a few things I found helpful. Some of you would have read this. This is a very old copy of it, but Roland Bainton's, this is the classic biography. It first came out, I think, in 1950. Here I Stand, A Life of Martin Luther. How many of you have read this before? Yeah, I bet a handful of you have. So this is the classic one. It's very well written, and he was a legitimate scholar. I think he was at Yale, but inspirational. And more recently, Carl Trueman, who was here last year, many of you know of Carl's work. He did a book in this series that Crossway has on people and the Christian life, which is really good. There's a new one coming out soon on Tim Keller and the Christian life. This one is on Luther and the Christian life. So it's not a biography exactly, though he has one biographical chapter, and my outline here will track with what Carl's done. But this is great to get Luther's sort of theology of discipleship in the Christian life. And one of the world's experts, he's deceased now, but one of the world's experts on Luther was a German by the name of Heiko Obermann. Probably haven't read this, but look, it's got a nice cover. And for a Luther biography, it's only 350 pages, which is pretty svelte, unlike Luther at the end of his life. And my professor of church history when I was in college did his PhD under Heiko Obermann, who was considered at the time the world's foremost expert on Luther. And this title, which is reflected a bit in what I'll talk about, Luther, Man Between God and the Devil. And one of the unique things that this biography does is try to present Luther as a medieval man. We'll talk about that. And he was a medieval man. And how much of his polemic sees the world of demons and the devil. So this is another really good biography. If you want to read one thing and you don't have time to make yourself an armchair Luther scholar, and you want to read one thing on the Reformation, in fact, I need to make sure we have this in the book nook if we don't already, but by Michael Reeves, The Unquenchable Flame. You can see this is under 200 pages, and Michael Reeves, who's from England, and you've maybe heard his voice before. It's very elegant and very posh. He does the narration for The Biggest Story Bible Storybook, if you ever watched those videos. And I saw him at a conference, and I said, "What's so good about your voice? I wrote this book, and they don't have me do this." But he does have and he's a very good writer. So this is one. Barry, can you talk to Caleb and make sure if we don't have this book that we get this in the bookstore, because this is really good read. And then if you want to read some of Luther on your own, the collected works of Luther are, hundreds of volumes. This, I think, is still in print, but this is edited by a guy named John Dillenberger, Martin Luther selections from his writings, and this really gives you the essential stuff. You just want to read some of Luther for yourself. So there you go, and you can look at any of these and get these titles afterward. So let's get rolling. Martin Luther. By the turn of the 15th century, so Martin Luther, we're talking 1483 to 1546. He's born at the end of the 15th century. By the time we get to the end of the 1400s, it was obvious that the church was in desperate need of reform. That's where we left off, a real cliffhanger, I'm sure you remember, at the end of the class last fall. Outside of the church, there were great foment around who really had the authority in the empire, people jockeying for power. This constant push and pull from the time of Constantine, who converted to Christianity in the beginning of the 4th century, all the way until this time. Who really has control? Is it the emperor? Is it the civil magistrate? Or is it the church? And is it the pope? And within the church, there was a constant debate. There was something called the Avignon papacy, which was where there were rival popes, and one went off to France, Avignon. There was the Great Western Schism, a similar controversy, and there were councils that emerged to try to decide, because this isn't like a church split that we might think of it as Protestants. Oh, that's really sad, a church divided, and They like that pastor, and so that pastor just goes down the road and starts another church. No, this is like rival presidents. No, that's the real one. No, that's the real one. And the whole empire was threatened by these papal schisms. But even more importantly and more obviously to people, the laity suffered under from our vantage point, a spiritually punishing and financially punishing system of merits. To have the sacrament of penance, you had to show real contrition, but then you also had to make satisfaction. And this could be in some kind of pilgrimage, some kind of good works, and later, as we'll hear, through financial gifts to the church. So it was financially exacting, it was spiritually punishing. How can one know that you have really been forgiven and are right with God? Even the monastic orders, which originally sprung up and were inspirational. Remember, the monastic movement in part grew up once martyrdom no longer was a reality. Okay, how do we show that we are really, really serious about being Christians? Well, most people didn't want to be martyrs, but actually some did. And the church had to teach people, no, it doesn't count if you go and you volunteer to be a martyr. That seems very strange to us. But people who do CrossFit seem strange to us. People who punish their bodies in other ways. Well, that's what they thought of it. So the monastic movement started out inspirational, and yet it constantly devolved into corruption. It grew in wealth, and so another monastic order would grow up. By the time of Luther, even the monastic movement was running out of some spiritual steam. Especially noticeable were the moral failings of the clergy. There were many. Simony, that's named after Simon Magus from the book of Acts. That refers to the buying and selling of church office. This is how you make money, and why would you want a church office? Because this was one of the best professions you could have in the medieval world. So simony, the buying and selling of church offices, and with that came absenteeism. Well, that's just like the word sound. It means you're absent. So you could accumulate many offices or benefices, which referred to any kind of paid position in the church. And so one man might have many, many different jobs. Like he's a pastor and he teaches at seminary. Okay, that sounds bad. But different than that, because hopefully I show up for those jobs. But these people were usually absent, and they would have multiple bishoprics, they would have multiple church offices, and they never showed their face in those places, but it was a way of accumulating titles and accumulating wealth. And then there was the rather open practice of quote-unquote unmarried priests who were very obviously living with concubines and fathering children and being married in all but name only. Remember that the tradition of priests needing to be celibate was not there at the very beginning of the church. It developed over the first few hundred years, and it was one of the main cries for reform at the end of the Middle Ages. And I, for one, am very thankful for it. So the church was in desperate need of reform. And I think even Catholic scholars today would acknowledge that, and acknowledge that there are a lot of bad popes. I heard secondhand from a friend of mine who was hearing from a Catholic friend who was saying that he didn't think too highly of the current pope, and this was from a Catholic, and he wasn't a very good pope, and then he kind of turned to the side and he said, well, he still probably is in the top 20%. So there have been, even Catholics acknowledge, quite a number of bad popes. For example, Pope Alexander VI. Pope Alexander VI ruled the Catholic Church, head of the Catholic Church, 1492 to 1503. So right in this time when Luther is born. His given name was Rodrigo. You probably have heard of his family. He came from the infamous Borgia family of Spain. Now, I saw there was 10 years ago or so on HBO or Showtime television series, The Borgias, and I love historical kind of drama like that, but you got to read it first, because I read it and like, oh, every single episode has gratuitous nudity and sex scenes. And well, it might have been true, but I can't watch it. So don't go and watch it. But he was of this family, the Borgias, some people call the original crime family. Throughout his life, Rodrigo, who would become Pope Alexander VI, accumulated multiple titles, multiple church offices. He grew to possess great wealth and power, and he didn't try to hide, he admitted to fathering several children by a number of mistresses. This is the Pope, including 4 children with Venosa de Canetti, another child with a woman, Julia Farnese, who was 15, and he was 58, so we can call it an affair, and it was probably a lot worse than that if you're a 15-year-old. But she had just been married off to some nobleman. And then he had at least 6 other children with unknown women. When the 61-year-old Rodrigo, who had been scheming his whole life to be pope in 1492, it was widely understood that he secured the appointment through bribery, just cold, hard cash or silver or gold, and also the promise of ecclesiastical positions. Later, his enemies charged Alexander with conducting orgies in the Vatican, which was under construction, murder, incest, and scholars debate, well, those just sour grapes from his enemies. Even if those can't be proven, the fact that they were alleged and people said, well, maybe, is not a very good sign for your moral uprightness. When the Florentine friar, Girolamo, you may have heard of this name, Savonarola, he's an Italian Catholic reformer. He railed against papal corruption, and it was reported that when Alexander heard Savonarola's denunciations of his corruption, he responded with howls of laughter. And for his efforts, Savonarola was hanged and burned. So the church was in desperate need of reform. This medieval world was about to break up. Now, of course, none of us live in a historical epoch, and we know I am in this historical epoch, and later we'll move to this historical epoch. They didn't think of themselves as, it's been nice to be in the Middle Ages. No, we're in the last ages when you're alive. And that many of them consider it the last days, and they thought Christ would return. They didn't think of themselves as being in a particular time. And yet, from our historical vantage point, we can see that a number of things were in the air. Mysticism was promising a direct encounter with God. So that threatened the institutional church. Humanism, not secular humanism, but humanism, meaning recovering the wisdom of the Greeks and the Romans and going back to the original sources, that was threatening to throw out the whole scholastic tradition. And this is very important for the Reformation and for Luther, there were growing feelings of ethnic and national identity. Now, they weren't nation states in the way we have nation states. People talk about nationalism. Scholars say, well, nationalism is really probably only like 200 years old to, the beginning of the 1800s. So it's a different kind of nation. And yet there was more and more a French identity, a British identity, we'll see here a German identity, and there was less of a desire to want to see themselves as this pan-European Christian empire. But they were French and English and Spanish and Dutch and German, and that made a difference. The peasants were ready to revolt, and we'll see that they did. And when you have Columbus, so 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, followed by Magellan some decades later, who circumnavigated the whole globe. It was an era of discovery, of innovation. You just learned those people in a history class, but can you imagine hearing about, for the first time, someone sailed around the whole world? It'll be a big deal when Elon Musk gets somebody to Mars. This is an even bigger deal. They went around the whole world. And then you have the Copernican revolution in the beginning of the 1500s, displacing the geocentric view of the solar system, that the Earth was at the center, to a heliocentric, that the sun is at the center of our solar system. So there are a number of forces at play that change was bound to happen. But we don't want to think of Martin Luther as, on the one hand, the only one who made change happen. On the other hand, we don't want to say he's just a product of the forces. And no, the real people make a difference in what the world is like. Luther would start a new world-altering movement of church renewal. I remember I think it was on A&E or one of those channels when we were going from 1999 to 2000, and I think they did a series of the 100 most influential people of the last 1,000 years. Now, it was A&E, so I take it with a grain of salt, and it tended to be, very much slanted toward the present. So I think Diana was very high on the list. Nothing against Diana, but I don't know if she's going to prove to be the most influential of the last 1,000 years. But as I recall, number 2 was Luther, and number 1 was Gutenberg with the printing press. Well, yeah, those are certainly good choices for most influential. So people often put Luther as the start of the modern world. So I have one of the books I've used says the age the age of Reform 1517 to 1648. That's the Treaty of Westphalia. So 1517. So that makes it sound like Luther, boom, started. People went to bed on October 30th of 1517. They were medieval. They didn't know it, but they woke up on Halloween 1517, and they were modern. Of course, that's not how history works. I have another book that's called The Age of Reform 1250 to 1550. Well, that puts a very different spin on it. That puts Luther and the beginning of the Reformation at the very end of a medieval movement of renewal and reform. And you can certainly make the case for both. Luther was a man who straddled these different epochs as we've come to see them. So what about Luther? He was born November 10, 1483, to Hans and Margaret Luther. A few weeks later, the Luthers moved several miles up the road to Mansfield, which is about 60 miles northwest of Leipzig, which is what? Sort of central, south, west, east, south. So they're northwest of that. Ask our Europeans who are home where it is. So one of the interesting things is he was born in Eisleben. He lived there almost not at all, but through a providential luck of history, quote unquote, he died in Eisleben. So he was born there, he died there, even though he never really lived there. His father, Hans, grew up as a farmer. Almost everybody did, but he had become a miner as an adult. That sounds funny, but a miner. And he had worked his way up to a management position. So he was a part of this rising new thing that we would call the middle class. And as is often the case, if you have moved into the middle class and some kind of new social mobility, what do you want for your children? You want your children to have an even better life than you do. This is often the immigrant story in America. So he was insistent that Luther go to university. He went to the University of Erfurt in 1501, where he was to study law. There were basically 3 important things you could study: medicine, law, or theology. In 1505, on his way back to the university after visiting his parents, you may know this famous story, Martin got caught in a thunderstorm. Terrified by a bolt of lightning, he cried out, "Saint Anne, save me, and I'll become a monk." Any of you ever made that promise? I doubt it. I'll become a monk. Well, he already had an inkling that he wanted to become a monk. Again, for us as Protestants especially, but most people, that sounds strange. That sounds like, send me to jail first. Isn't it the same thing? I got to be a monk. But in the medieval mindset, if you were going to be serious about the Lord, just like somebody might say, oh, I went to college, I got involved in a campus ministry, I got on fire for the Lord, now what? I want to go to seminary. I want to learn more. I want to grow. I'm serious about my faith. Well, that's what the monastery was. And he cried out, save me. Now, he might have been a little shrewd here. St. Anne was the patron saint of miners. Again, these kind of pickaxe miners. And he knew, Luther did, that his father Hans was not going to look favorably upon him going to a monastery. No. This is not the last parent to probably say, I paid for you to do what? Be a lawyer, not a monk. But to make a vow, which was binding in the medieval world, and to do it according to St. Anne, who's the patron saint of the family, as a family of miners, Luther probably, it was real fear, but it may have also been a smart move to come back and say, Dad, I got to be a monk. Oh, really? Well, let me tell you about it. I made a vow to St. Anne that if she saved me, I'd become a monk. And so he did. 2 weeks later, he entered the Augustinian monastery at Erfurt. In 1507, Luther was ordained as a priest. A year later, he was transferred from the University of Erfurt, which had been founded in 1379. Man, these places, these Europeans, everything's old. I saw this thing online today. It must have been from a Brit or a European. It was making fun of Americans, and it said, here's a map of every American city, and it was like Costco, Sam's Club, historic building, and then it said in parentheses, established 1965. And it was like, yeah, that's what, come visit our historic building. It's 50 years old. But 1379, and he was transferred from Erfurt to the town that you've heard of Wittenberg, and there was a university there. Now, even old things at one time had to be new things. The University of Wittenberg was a little upstart university that had started in 1502. So Luther is transferred there. He had been studying at Erfurt, teaching at Erfurt. Now he's going to go and get a doctoral degree at Wittenberg and do some teaching at Wittenberg. So this is, we say, wow, it was founded in 1502. Yeah, well, this was 1507. It's 5 years old. This is a new start school going from Erfurt to Wittenberg. And with a few interruptions, this is where Luther would be the rest of his life. Carl Trueman points out in his book that there were two significant providential blessings in being transferred to Wittenberg. One, as a new institution, I need to introduce you to this man who looms very large and important in Luther's life. It's a man named Frederick. He's come to be known as Frederick the Wise. I don't know when he became that. I'd like to be Kevin the Wise, but I'll have to save it for the historians to debate. But he was Frederick the Wise, known to us. He helped, he established this university in Wittenberg. He is the elector over this region of Saxony. Now, one of the things, this is true even in our day, sometimes any publicity is good publicity. So Frederick would be motivated to protect Luther, who is his new hotshot professor at the new university. And so when Luther makes a big splash, Frederick has a motivation. Well, when Luther's famous, Wittenberg is famous, that makes Saxony famous, and that makes Frederick the Wise more important. So that was providential. Even though it was a new school, there was a motivation. This guy is bringing us a lot of publicity. He does some crazy tweets out there, but he's bringing us a lot of publicity. The second providential thing that Trueman points out. So Frederick the Wise, over Prince of Saxony, is what was called an elector. The Holy Roman Empire, and it's often said that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but it was a residual kind of holdover of the old Roman Empire. Think about today Germany, across Central Europe. That's the Holy Roman Empire. And the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was chosen by 7 electors. And one of those electors was the Prince of Saxony, who was Frederick. So even though Saxony wasn't all that important, and Wittenberg certainly wasn't important, Frederick, being one of the 7 men who chooses the emperor, had an outsized influence and prestige and power. And his power would be very necessary to protect Luther throughout his life. So 5 years later, so Luther becomes a monk in 1505, and then to Wittenberg in 1507. Now in the winter of 1510 and 1511, Luther makes his first trip to Rome. One book says, we think of Rome. I've not been to Rome. I bet a lot of you haven't even been to Rome. Yeah, you recommend I go there? It's definitely a bucket list trip. So it was still Rome, the great city, but one book said it was kind of like the Las Vegas of the empire. It was a lot of glitz, a lot of glamour, and you went there and there were carnival barkers, and there's a lot of this going on, especially for Christians making pilgrimages to Rome. So Luther is a part of a 2-monk team that's going to negotiate some dispute, and they have to go to Rome and make this arduous trip over the Alps. And Luther's the junior partner in this venture, so he doesn't have a lot to do. He's making this his own personal pilgrimage, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see the holy shrines, the holy places. And one day, he visited the holy stairs, the Scala Sancta, the holy stairs. These are reputed, though surely not true, to be the very steps that Christ ascended during his trial before Pontius Pilate. These are the stairs that Jesus himself walked upon. Yes, they had been transported, apparently, from Jerusalem all the way over to Rome, but there they were. And there were other holy staircases throughout the empire, but this was it. And pilgrims would come, and on every step, there were relics and carved crosses and maybe bones of the martyrs or a hair from this famous saint. It was an unparalleled opportunity to procure a plenary indulgence for yourself or for others. To do this pilgrimage was a way that you could earn merit and draw upon the merit of the saints and reduce your time in purgatory. We'll come back to indulgences in just a moment. And Luther, a young man racked with guilt, dutifully climbed all 28 steps on his knees, kissing each step as he went and repeating the Lord's Prayer all the way up to the top. And as earnest as he was, this ascent up the Scala Sancta provided no relief for Luther. Upon reaching the top, Luther looked back down and said to himself, "Who can know if these things are so? Did I really merit something with the Lord? Did I really reduce my time in purgatory?" He desperately wanted to know that he was right with God. That's why he was almost literally killing himself with vigils and prayers and a punishing diet in pursuit of obedience. Years later, he reflected on his rigors as a monk, and he said, quote, "I kept the rules so strictly that I may say that if ever a monk got to heaven by his sheer monkery, it was I." He was a monk greater than which none could be conceived, and yet he did not feel that it made a difference. Was he really right with the Lord? And it's easy for us to say, can you believe people would go to such extremes to try to effect some sort of cosmic justice in the world? But then you think about our own self-imposed laws with food or carbon or the words you can or can't say. I'm not making light of the various debates around all of those things. It's simply to say that it's a very human impulse to say, I have to live this certain life of austerity to prove to myself and to others that I'm a righteous human being. And Luther felt that. Indulgences. I already mentioned that it was considered a work of indulgence. Well, what were indulgences? Probably heard of them before. And the Catholic Church still sells indulgences. Despite being one of the richest landowners on the planet, which is true, the Roman Catholic Church at the beginning of the 16th century was, like many rich people, always broke, it seemed. Partly to blame were massive building projects. So it's at this time, they're building St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. Pope Leo II is the Pope until 1521. So during Luther's early phase of his ministry, he needed to raise more money. There had been a couple of papal bulls. Now, that's a funny word, but it just means an official document, so named for the seal that would be placed on the document. And papal bulls are always named after the first word or the first two words in the bull. It doesn't always tell you that much about what it was. But there was a papal bull in 1343, Unigenitus, which established the dogma of the treasury of merits. So this is, there are certain people that were so holy that they had enough merit for themselves, but also for others. So Christ, for sure, also the Virgin Mary, many of the apostles, the saints, the martyrs. And so they do these good works, and it goes in superabundance to the treasury of merit. Well, that's there to help all the rest of us who don't have enough merit of our own. So that's one bull. Then in 1476, closer to this time, there's another bull, Salvator Noster, and the Catholic Church established that those who gave financial gifts to the church could tap into this treasury of merit. Well, that is convenient. Indulgences then allowed church officials to sell release from purgatory, or at least a reduced sentence for yourself and for your loved ones. Again, Protestants, 2024, we can say, what dupes? But put yourself in that mindset. You care very much about the afterlife. You care about your family. Everyone that you know was a Christian, and none of us are good enough to go to heaven all on our own. We know we need Christ's grace to live a life pleasing to Him, but we're going to go to purgatory. And if I can give a gift to the church and it helps the Pope build a glorious basilica, and then some of my loved ones will be released from their anguish in the flames, well, of course. Why wouldn't I do this? The most notorious salesman, some of you have heard of, the Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel. And he came up with this ditty. Now, I don't know, because obviously he didn't speak in English. So at some point, it's translated into English, and it's made into this rhyme, which really sticks with you. Every time a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. However he said it in German or Latin that people could understand it. He said, come on, come one, come all. I was at the beach this summer for 5 days at Ocean Isle, and there's the poor guys when it's 94 degrees outside who are selling the slushies or the popsicles and the thing, and just walking up and down. And you want one that's already melted? Here it is, $5. And he wasn't too aggressive, but you imagine a Johann Tetzel walking through the streets and the cobblestones. Indulgences, get your indulgences. He was a real showman. He went so far as to say that one of Tetzel's indulgences could cover your sin even if you had raped the Virgin Mary. Yeah, it was extreme. Now, at first, Luther didn't necessarily oppose indulgences outright, but he could see how they were abused. The whole enterprise was crass commercialism, fleecing the flock, cheapened grace. It preyed on people's fears. It gave them false assurance. And so, in 1517, on Easter Sunday, he preached a sermon on indulgences and didn't say much about it for the next months until famously on October 31st, 1517, he nailed the world-changing 95 Theses on the castle door of the church at Wittenberg. Now, we say world-changing because historians look back and say, that is the start of the Reformation. And even today, we will at least note it. We may have a special sermon about it when we come to that Sunday around October 31st, 1517. Remember listening to a Garrison Keillor, if you ever Lake Wobegon and all, Garrison Keillor, who make up these stories about this fictional Lutheran community. And he said whenever they had Reformation Sunday, they would sing "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," and they would open all the windows so the Catholics could hear it. But they didn't think to themselves, Luther didn't think he was starting a Reformation. In fact, the 95 Theses were not that radical. Famously, the first one says, when our Lord and Master Jesus Christ said, "Repent," he called for the entire life of believers to be one of penitence. So this was about penance, and it was about indulgences. And don't think of it as this defiant act, as if, Luther was spray painting graffiti on the lawn of the White House or something. This is simply what you did to call for an academic disputation. This is posting something on a blog. This is putting something forth on the faculty bulletin board. So this was not an unheard of act. It was very common. You post these 95 Theses on the church door, and it's to say, all right, let's have a discussion. I want an academic disputation about these things. Momentum would build after this act. The 95 Theses, usually not by Luther, but by others, were translated and distributed widely. It became a popular tract, a rallying point. And things quickly snowball. In 1518, he has something called the Heidelberg Disputation, which is really a much more significant theological moment than the 95 Theses. The Heidelberg Disputation is where Luther first puts this contrast between the theology of glory and the theology of the cross. Now, we think theology of glory, well, that's good, but what Luther meant was two different approaches to the Christian life. The theology of glory, which is merit and triumph and boasting and strength, or the theology of the cross, which embraces weakness and humility and acknowledges our utter dependence upon God. And in some ways, that's his most significant theological and spiritual legacy, is reminding the church about the way of the cross. In 1519, he has a debate in Leipzig with one of the famous doctors of the church, John Eck. And in between that, Heidelberg 1518, Leipzig 1519, Luther was summoned to appear in Rome. Now, this probably would have meant death, imprisonment, or banishment for Luther. Okay, this is really being called into the principal's office. You have to come to Rome. The Pope wants to see you. Frederick wisely, he's living up to his name, said, no. Luther is a German, and if he's going to be questioned, he's going to be questioned in Germany. And for some reason, the church allows it. And they have a diet, an assembly of Augsburg that met in 1518. And at that diet, Luther was supposed to be taken into custody, but Frederick refused. Frederick may have been thinking theologically. He agreed with Luther. He was sympathetic to the Reformation, but he was also trying, remember, to build up the prestige of Saxony, and he's also playing off these regional ethnic rivalries. To say, no, we're not going to trust our wonderful Saxon hero with these dirty Italians. No offense to the Italians. But that's just how, that's the sort of sectional rivalries that are being played up. Well, now Luther is a theological hero, he's a German hero, and he is given safe passage back to Wittenberg. In January 1519, Emperor Maximilian died. So this puts a pause on everything. Okay, the Holy Roman Emperor is dead. It also made Frederick, remember he's one of the 7 electors. This made Frederick even more important because he's one of the 7 people who will choose the next emperor. And in quick order, they choose of the House of Habsburg, Charles V is the Holy Roman Emperor. But this presses pause on the Luther drama as they, got to figure out who the emperor is going to be. Somewhere in this, 1518 to 1519, Luther has what's come to be known as his Tower experience. Probably this is the date. Now it's important to realize Luther, this is 1518 or 1519, Luther doesn't write about this until 1545, the year before he dies, when the Latin edition of his works are coming out, and he writes a preface for it, which he gives some autobiography. So this is, 27 years later. So we do have to think it's quite possible that Luther is reinterpreting himself through a more mature Reformation lens. Now, we don't know, but this is how he depicts what happened back in 1518 and 1519. You may be familiar with this story. He said his whole life was lived in dread of one phrase in the Bible. You know what it is? The righteousness of God. He said, quote, "Though I lived as a monk without reproach, I felt that I was a sinner before God with an extremely disturbed conscience." He said he hated the righteousness of God. It signaled to Luther his inability to ever satisfy God's law, and so he was angry with God. Luther knew he was a sinner. There's no problem understanding that. And he knew he deserved God's wrath, but he didn't know what to do about it. And then he had his breakthrough, this Tower experience. Quote, "There I began to understand that the righteousness of God is that by which the righteous lives by a gift of God, namely faith." Oh, so he understands now. The righteousness of God is not the righteousness by which God punishes me, but the righteousness of God is the gift of his righteousness, which is mine by faith. He said, "This helped me see a totally other face of the entire Scriptures. That now the Bible was a message about what God had done for us rather than all the things we had to do for God." Quote, "And I extolled my sweetest word with a love as great as the hatred with which I had before hated the word righteousness of God." He said, "I loved it just as much as I used to hate it." Now, there's a very curious thing that historians note here, is Luther says, quote, "The Holy Spirit gave me this realization and there's a word, how you translate it, but you could translate it in the bathroom, the cloaca. So people say, did Luther was an earthy guy. Is he acknowledging he had this world-changing insight when he was in the bathroom? Not for the last time that probably somebody had an insight on the bathroom. Now, people try to rescue Luther and say, well, it's quite possible that the whole area of that tower was referred to, and he was really talking about the tower above the bathroom, and just talking about a private chamber, and so that's how many people interpret it. Some say that this was a kind of spiritual metaphor, that he might not have meant literally, but if you permit me to say a word I don't have my kids say, it's kind of like saying, well, I had this insight when I was down in the crapper. Okay, I don't want my kids to use that word, but there are worse words. A way of saying, I was in the absolute pits. I was in the toilet. I was in the spiritual toilet, and this insight came to me. It was his breakthrough moment. In 1520, Luther pens three of his most important treatises: the Babylonian Captivity of the Church, that's about the sacraments; the Freedom of the Christian, that's about justification and loving our neighbors; and then an appeal to German nobility, which is calling on the magistrates. Interestingly, he's calling on the magistrates to take power away from the church. He's saying, look, the church has gotten into all sorts of stuff it doesn't belong in. It's the richest landowner in Europe. It's taxing people. It's so concerned about maintaining its earthly kingdoms. Nobility, rise up. That's your job. The church needs to recover its true spiritual purpose. Well, the Pope has had enough. On December 10, 1520, back up, on October 10, 1520, a papal bull arrives in Wittenberg, Exsurge Domini, which is excommunicating Luther. It's easy to remember. October 10 is my son Jacob's birthday. That's when he gets the bull. And then on December 10, that's my son Andrew's birthday. Pick a date. Somebody's got a birthday. On December 10, Luther led a procession through Wittenberg, and they burned the papal bull and many of the books of the canon lawyers. As if to say, all right, it's on. Come and get us. Well, they did want to come and get him. In April of 1521, Luther was summoned to appear before the imperial diet. It's one of the accidents of the English language that the Diet of Worms looks like a diet of worms. But a diet is an assembly, and Worms is a city. He's summoned to appear there before Charles V, the Holy Roman Empire. And Luther is frightened. How could you not be? His livelihood, his very life is on the line. We think of him as bold and brash, but this is just 4 years after the 95 Thesis. He's not well established. He has Frederick's support, he has popular support, but he's going before the Holy Roman Emperor and before the church, and famously they lay out Luther's writings. Did you write these? He said, yes. Well, do you recant? And he, what parts here? Because a lot of what I say is just what other popes have said. No, do you recant? And he asked for a day to think about it. And then he finally comes back, and some of the most famous sentences ever uttered. My conscience is captive to the word of God, Luther declared. Thus I cannot and will not repent, for going against my conscience is neither safe nor salutary. I can do no other. And then historians debate if he said these last words, but I think he should have. So, here I stand, God help me, amen. He certainly made the speech that said, I cannot recant. Now notice, he didn't just say, my conscience. People want to make him out to be the modern hero of the conscience and just, whatever you do, is as long as it's right for you. Now, Luther says, my conscience is captive to the word of God. Luther was then, by the Edict of Worms, placed under a, quote, ban and double ban. Well, that sounds bad. It meant that you could not give Luther food, you could not give him safe passage, you could not give him drink, you could not hide him, you could not support him, you could not encourage him, or your life would be in danger. Luther was a man on the run. But before he could run very far, Frederick arranged for Luther to be captured. And so some armed men capture Luther. They put him away in one of Frederick's castles. Frederick says, don't tell me what castle it's in. He's got a lot of castles. I don't want to know. So when the Pope says, where's Luther? I can say, I don't know where he is. But just go hide him in a castle. So he's hidden away for the better part of a year in the Wartburg castle. And if you see some pictures of Luther where he's got a big scraggly beard, this is his recluse year. Well, he continues to write. He does polemical treatises. And what would you do if you were trapped in a castle? Well, he translates the New Testament into German, which is every bit as important as the Geneva Bible or the King James Bible or Calvin's work in French for not only the Reformation in Germany, but just the German language. When he returns to Wittenberg in 1522, he finds that things are not as he left them. Two of his colleagues, one by the name of Karlstadt, had taken the Reformation in a much more radical direction. One of the themes we'll see in these weeks is what one set of people want as reformation and renewal, another people say we need revolution. And so Karlstadt was leaning in that way. He was taking on more of a Zwinglian understanding of the Lord's Supper. We'll come to that next week. He was encouraging a kind of socialism experiment in Wittenberg, and they were sympathetic, Luther's colleagues, to these people called the Zwickau prophets, 3 men who came and claimed to have direct, they were like the day's charismatics. They had direct revelation from God, and they were calling for radical reorientation of society. And Luther comes back and he says, whoa, this is not the Reformation I wanted. He exerts his personal influence and pulls things back, we might say, in a more mainstream direction. Now, I have lots more, and we have just a few more minutes. Let me try to highlight real quickly 3 people, 3 controversies. So I got like a minute for each of them, and then we'll land. The first, we have to say something about Katharina von Bora. So 3 people. Here's the first. A group of nuns had escaped from a cloister. I mean, Luther's life is a movie. And Luther had arranged for all of these nuns to be married, but there was one who remained, Catherine von Bora. And she had an interest in marrying Luther. Luther wasn't so sure of it, but he agreed to marry her, quote, in defiance of the devil. Now, of all the reasons to get married, you know, when the proposal comes, you say, in defiance of the devil, yes. But he quickly found that my Lord Katie, as he sometimes called her, was every bit his match in wits and personality. And he said at the end of his life, he was blessed with, quote, the happiest marriage. According to medieval custom, you can be glad some customs have changed. The couple would first be engaged. Engagements were legally binding. It's like in Mary and Joseph, remember? He had to divorce her quietly, even though they were betrothed, because engagements were legally binding. It wasn't today, you don't have to file any paperwork to get engaged or unengaged. But this was legally binding before the church. And when you were engaged, then you would consummate the relationship. Now, just kids, just the engagement, don't go off and do it in secret. This was a big problem all throughout the Middle Ages and even the early modern period. There were all sorts of secret marriages. People that want to have sex, because people have always wanted to have sex, they're like in secret, they're having a moment. Let's get married. We're married. Woo! And then they go at it, okay? And then that's not what they wanted. A public engagement, and then a few weeks later, you would have the official wedding ceremony. Well, either in that consummation after the engagement, or more likely after the wedding ceremony itself, these wedding feasts could be really ribald affairs. Couples would be placed in a bed together, shrouded with covers, with all of the attendants and the party still there, singing and cheering as they did the marriage act under the covers. Glad that some customs have fallen by the wayside. The wedding night, in other words, was not spent in private, some out-of-the-way hotel, but with your family and friends in the very same room, cheering you on. One of Luther's best friends, Justus Jonas, said, quote, I could not suppress my tears at the sight. And historians debate, what sort of tears were those? Was this, or this is the worst moment of my life? Luther often told bawdy jokes. His language was colorful, replete with sexual innuendo. You probably wanted to hang out with Luther, and you want your kids to be like Calvin. And just their sort of personalities. It was not uncommon. People often talk, I'm not going to get through all this, but we'll pick up next week. Good word for you that you don't use is scatological. Scat refers to feces. One person said that Luther's polemic was often scatological. Now, this was not just to Luther. There's a famous drawing, a wood cutting, and it's in multiple of those books by Lucas Cranach, who is a famous artist. And it shows this sort of gremlin-looking demon who is, I have no way to put this delicately, pooping out the Pope and all of his bishops and all of his attendants. And this was how you depicted to the common people, this is where the papacy comes from. So you think, wow, man, we have, the church is really, no, there have been a lot of colorful things that have happened. And Luther could give as good as he got. So 2 young graduates from Leipzig wrote a couple of pamphlets condemning Luther for his marriage. They said Katie, his wife, was a whore, and Luther was dishonoring Christ. And Luther responded, as he often did, with scatological references, and he informed the men that their letters had been taken to the toilet, quote, illuminated with dung, and were now used to wipe the bottoms of the members of his household. So that was Luther. Not the way Calvin spoke, but the way Luther did. The second person to mention is the Dutch humanist Erasmus of Rotterdam, brilliant scholar, fierce critic of the church, but not a Protestant. And he and Luther famously broke over the freedom of the will. And in 1525, Luther wrote perhaps his best theological work, The Bondage of the Will. He argues for the authority of Scripture, the clarity of Scripture, human inability before God. And the third person is Ulrich Zwingli. Next week we'll come to Zwingli. In 1529, there's something that is now called the Marburg Colloquy. How do you spell colloquy, I think? A gathering, a consultation. And it had Lutherans and Reformed. Now, you hear Reformed and you think Calvin, but Calvin's not on the scene in 1529. He's 20 years old. But Reformed refers to Zwingli and his side. So famously, at the Marburg Colloquy, you have Luther, you have Zwingli, you have some of the most important theologians of the day, Philip Melanchthon, Martin Bucer, one of the great Reformation names, Johannes Ecolampadius, and they're debating the Lord's Supper, and they agree there's 15 statements about the Lord's Supper that they're trying to agree on. You know how many they agree on? Yeah, 14 and a half. But they can't agree on whether or not Christ is really present in the Lord's Supper. And the Reformed and the Lutheran split. Now, from our vantage point, we say, really, you couldn't find a way to agree on that last half point, and yet we have to be sympathetic. This is how important they took their doctrine, how important they considered the Lord's Supper. Luther said famously, Zwingli was, quote, of a different spirit. Zwingli was from Zurich, which was a rising urban center. Luther was in the little towns of Eisleben, Mansfield, Wittenberg. Zwingli had been trained in humanism. Luther had a thoroughly medieval education. They were not of the same personality, and they split over that point. Well, we will come back because I want to give Luther his due and talk about 3 controversies and then something of his death and legacy, and that will bring us into Zwingli, who overlaps with Luther, born before him, died before him, and we'll come next week. And so a cliffhanger to find out what happens with the rest of Luther's life. So see you next week.